You are listening to the Life in Attleboro podcast, where we interview the city's most interesting people who are making a positive difference in our community. Hey everyone, I'm the host of the Life in Attleboro podcast, Mike Sullivan. I recently spoke with Bristol County Sheriff and former Mayor of Attleboro, Paul Heroux. He peeled the curtain back on what it's like to be sheriff, what he has planned for the future, and he shared something he hasn't talked about publicly many times, if at all, about his experience in Saudi Arabia that ended with gunshots. Here's episode 45 of the Life in Attleboro podcast. Okay, joining me now is Bristol County Sheriff Paul Heroux. Sheriff Heroux is the former mayor of Attleboro. You probably know the name, you probably know the face. He grew up in our great city and remains a very active member of our community. Sheriff Heroux, thank you so much for taking a time out of your busy schedule to be a guest on the Life in Attleboro podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
I really appreciate it, sir. So you've been in your current position since January of 2023. First question, what's it like to be the Bristol County Sheriff?
90% of my job really is addressing personnel issues. And I inherited a jail system with about 600 employees, about 700 inmates. And one person was there for 25 years. And like any other person, he also had blind spots, and I have my own blind spots. And so there were a lot of things I needed to attend to when I got here. But the biggest challenges are the personnel issues. But in addition to personnel issues, I basically have three constituencies, and you can say fourth if you include the voters. But the first constituency are the employees. The second constituency are the inmates. And the third is the bricks and mortar, making the building and infrastructure of the campus a better place. And the fourth constituency would be the voters. But those are the three things I really have to work on: making better work conditions for the employees, making just more programming and better reentry efforts for the inmates, and then also improving the physical plan.
A lot of that too comes down to buy-in from all of the people that you just mentioned. How is that? How were you able to kind of get the group on your team early on in the process?
Yeah, so I brought in a new senior staff, and I held a couple of people over from senior staff from the previous administration. The unions I have a good relationship with. I work well with the unions. They see that I'm trying to do some things. There's been some times where information hasn't always gotten out to all the members. So it's interesting. I can go and talk to any employee about employee issues anytime I want. But if it's a union issue, I'm not allowed to. The law doesn't allow me to do direct dealing with the union. I have to go through the union stewards. But basically, I have a good relationship with them, though. There's two main unions. There's the Makufu union and the NCEU union. But some of the changes have been well received. What I try to tell people as much information as I can, because in the absence of information, people just make things up. And when I first got to the jail, compared to what they were used to, I was probably over communicating. And I had to explain there's a difference between an idea and a plan. So when I would float an idea to everybody through an email saying, hey, give me your thoughts, I'm thinking about this, some people would freak out. They would, oh my God, he's going to do it. I was like, I'm not going to do that. This is just an idea. I want your input. And they weren't used to that. They had never really gotten asked before. And this is just rank and file officers. Sure. I'd send out an email to all users and say, hey, give me some ideas. And so they weren't really used to that. So that was one of the first lessons I had to say is, look, I tend to think out loud, and some of my ideas are just ideas. But when it becomes a plan, that's different. We're not at the planning stage of stuff yet, but that's for the employees. As far as the inmates go, pretty much any changes were welcome changes, whether it's better programming, better menu, if it's better reentry services, putting air conditioning in the housing units. And that's actually something the officers ask me to do because it's 85, 90 degrees in there. Wow. But the inmates are there. It's well received by them as well. So when we bring the temperature down, we bring the tempers down in the summertime, and there's less fights that will happen as a result of that.
That makes sense. So was becoming sheriff always a goal of yours, or did you get here by seizing opportunities as they presented themselves?
I'm surprised my opponent didn't hop on this, because in November of 2001, the Sun Chronicle reporter asked me, now that you won re-election for mayor for your third term, and you've said this is your last term, what's next? You're going to go for Congress, you're going to go for lieutenant governor, you're going to go for sheriff. And I said, I really don't want to go back to jail, because I worked in jail in Philadelphia and I worked in the prison system in Massachusetts. So I was like, yeah, I've been there, done that. I don't really want to go back to it. my opponents never used that against me, but I quite honestly, I'm honest about it. I got talked into it. Like there was a lot of people that were saying, "Hey, the incumbent's been there for 25 years. We really desperately need change." And so I looked at it very closely and I said, "Okay, how much of an impact could I make? Assuming I get elected to these other offices, how much of an impact could I make relative to what I could do in the jail?" And I said, there's probably the most room for good to be done for change, like in an organization, like at the jail. So I ran for this, got elected, but I wouldn't rule out those other offices in the future because I love what I do. I love being elected, but at the same time, I don't like to stay in any one place for too long. I like to move around. I was a state rep for 2.5 terms, then became mayor for 2.5 terms. Now I'm sheriff. I'm not going to be sheriff for life doing this, and then eventually I'll move on to something else. I just want to improve the jail and then move on, kind of improve the school budget, improve some of the green ordinances, built 5 miles of sidewalks all over the city, and then moved on, left on a high note. So I'll do the same thing here.
So, Sheriff, what is and what does a typical day look like for you, or is there no such thing as that when you're sheriff?
Well, 90% of what I deal with are personnel issues, because if you have the right people doing a good job, the place pretty much runs itself. And so that's where I really focus on the employees. That's the vast majority of my time. But I go to a lot of, I'll talk a lot. I'll go talking, this morning, I talked to a reentry collaborative about the reentry work we're doing at the jail, as well as some other issues, like I mentioned, air conditioning and no-cost calls, the immigration issue, what we're doing, what we're not doing on those things. But so I'll go to give talks in the public on that. I go to different council on aging, talk to senior citizens about scams. If I'm invited to a school, I'll go there as well and give a talk about civics and stuff. But the 90% of what I do are personnel issues. And I have certain principles of management that I've created over the course of time that I stick to because I don't know everything. And there's no way I can know all of the operations. There's no way I can know the nuances of it. And even if somebody really specializes in security, that person who knows security inside and out, they might not know and make programs inside and out. The people that specialize in programs don't know security. The people that are working on the physical plant. So my first rule of management is never make decisions alone. I didn't do it as mayor, and I'm not doing it now. So a lot of my day is I'm in meeting with people about this issue and that issue. That's one of the big management principles. Another one is treat everyone the same, because you got to really be fair with how, otherwise you end up with disparate treatment. If you have disparate treatment, then you're going to end up losing DLR issues. I like to give staff credit when they come up with an idea, publicly recognize them in front of other staff. And just communicate with the staff a lot. So those are some of the management principles I have. So yeah, it's pretty much the day.
So some of the things you said, Sheriff, reminded me, because I'm also in a management role, obviously a much smaller level than you. But one of the things that always stuck out to me is the saying, it said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. You can have the best strategy in the world. If you don't have buy-in from your team, if you don't create the culture of them wanting to be there and be part of it, none of the strategy matters. And I feel like you have built that culture yourself.
Yeah. In the absence of information, people just make stuff up and they assume the worst. And so that's part of changing the culture, is to letting people know what we're doing, but not only what we're doing, why we're doing it. And because if I don't communicate that, people just make stuff up, that it's human nature or something. But especially in today's hyper-political climate, that also people are seeing what goes on at the federal level and the national level, and that they're bringing it into our local levels. But yeah, if we don't change the culture, and part of that is getting rid of the employees who were a real toxic presence. And what I'm specifically referring to are people who would just bang out sick all the time. They were constantly abusing sick time. And then when they abuse sick time, somebody else gets forced to do overtime. And then when that person that gets forced, they can't go home to their family. They miss the Little League game or the play or the recital or something. So they miss just having a night off. So getting rid of a lot of those employees, I've fired more people in the last year as sheriff than I did as 5 years as mayor. So I inherited a situation where the issue wasn't being properly addressed, but that's the biggest problem we have with morale is forced overtime. The employees I did a survey recently. The number one issue was what they said was low pay, but the pay has actually gotten a lot better. So that as an issue has come down. But the next one was the forced overtime issue. So the pay is what it is. That's all determined by contract negotiation. And by the way, the union voted unanimously for the contract, the last one we did. So that's why I don't think that's a bigger issue, even though they say it is. I think really, if the forced overtime came down, that would drastically improve the culture and the morale.
Well said. And all this kind of leads me to my next question. So, Sheriff Heroux, I'm going to read some of your academic achievements really quickly and then follow it with a question. So, sure. You have your master's in public administration from the Harvard University School of Government. You have your master's in criminology from the University of Pennsylvania. You have your master's in international relations from the London School of Economics. And you have your bachelor's in psychology and neuroscience from the University of Southern California. Sheriff, you are much smarter than I am. The last one I just mentioned, however, the bachelor's in psychology and neuroscience, how much does that come into play as the Bristol County Sheriff?
Oh, actually, a lot of those come into play in different ways, but I will add 2 extra bits, though. One of them is that I did all the coursework for the PhD in criminology at the University of Pennsylvania. I just never finished it. But before all of that, I almost dropped out of high school. I had horrible high school grades, like just atrocious. I can't believe I graduated from Attleboro High School, class of 95, nice. But I was at the very bottom of the class. And so after I graduated high school, I had to go to night school to get my grades up a little bit. So I went to Providence College and Fisher College night school, got my grades up, then went to Rhode Island College, further got my grades up, and then I transferred to the University of Southern California. So it's not like I just walked into like those big universities. I clawed my way up. But as far as the psychology and neuroscience, that I use all 4 degrees every day. The management principles from the Harvard School of Government, that's just learning from people who used to be like Assistant Secretary of Defense or Assistant Secretary of State. People, those are my professors. Secretary of Treasury, Larry Summers. They not only they teach you the academics, they also teach you about management as well. It's a public administration program. With psychology, it's interesting. It's more about the employees that I will use psychology, like the understanding of it, not use it, but have an understanding than the inmates. Because, so for example, there's something called the fundamental attribution error. And with the fundamental attribution error, it's a concept in social psychology that says it's a mistake in thinking. And the mistake is to assume when I do something wrong, it's because of my environment. When you do something wrong, it's because you're either unethical or you're incompetent or something. And that's an error in thinking. And I think that explains a lot of what happens with the way people interact with each other. Because what we should be doing by default is when I do something wrong, what did I do wrong? Instead of saying it was my environment, and when you did something wrong, before I say you're incompetent or you're unethical, what in the environment led you up to that? So that's a concept I fall back on quite a bit. Also projection, just people, this is an interesting one. People see their faults in other people, but that doesn't mean every fault is your own. So you can't have a fault that you see that's not your own. But people typically, they see their faults in other people, they project. It usually comes with insecurities. And that's something you see a lot of times with politicians, especially you see them at the national level. And I'm often asked to comment on stuff like that, what's going on at the national level. But that's something that, and both sides do it. It's another way to put it is hypocrisy. But yeah, so psychology does come into play a lot of times with the people I work with, just like understanding human nature and dynamics, because I don't actually directly work with the inmates. I work with the staff who then work with the inmates.
Gotcha. So what are some of the more memorable days you've had as sheriff so far? Any stick out in particular?
Probably the most memorable would make the most sense. That was April 21st, 2023, when we had the inmate uprising.
Yes.
That was, and I call it an uprising, not a riot, because by definition, a riot needs violence. And nobody was hurt in this situation. Now, we could have a riot in the future. One could start in 5 minutes from now. You never know. Mm-hmm. But that was probably the most memorable day. I got the message like 7 o'clock in the morning or 7:15, whatever it was in the morning, that the inmates' beehive was starting to buzz a little bit differently, just the way the inmates were walking around talking. And so that was probably the most memorable. It got the most attention. But there's been other days as well. There's been some tough staff interactions I've had. Okay. And because even people I brought on sometimes didn't work out. And that's, like I said, I have to admit when I make a mistake. Some people weren't good hire, but then there's been some good times too. Promotion ceremonies and retirement ceremonies. Those are also quite memorable.
Good. What would you say to anyone, especially young people who want to begin a career in law enforcement in today's climate?
Yeah. Corrections is a great place to start, and it's a great place to have a career. I never thought I'd be back working in corrections. And like I said, I'm not going to be doing this forever. I'm here just to improve the jail, then leave on a high note. But you can have a full career here. You can have a career that makes a difference. In the sheriff and police, the difference between sheriff and police, the police arrest them, we hold them. So like the corrections officers are not police officers. They have a different but overlapping training. They don't carry guns. What you're trained to do as a corrections, see, the main difference between being a guard and a corrections officer, a lot of people call them, you got prison guards or jail guard. No. I used to be a lifeguard, and we see guards at the banks, and you sometimes see a guard at Whole Foods or something. Those people are just passively watching. They're just watching. A corrections officer is a trained professional that's trained how to manage people, and people who are dangerous, and oftentimes people who are trying to manipulate you as well. So the de-escalation training that you'll get and identifying when somebody is trying to scam you, these guys men and women are very astute. They watch human behavior all day. So it can be a really interesting career like that. Like you're going to learn in the 12-week training academy, you're going to learn some really unusual skills you might not otherwise have ever thought you would learn. Yeah. And then those carry into the real, like your other life, like in the non-work life. Some people use it as a stepping stone. Some people, they leave within the first few months or a year. Other people will stay a full career. So there's something here for everyone, whether you're using a transitionary or you want to make a full career out of it. But it's a tough job. Yeah. It's not for everybody. And it's certainly underappreciated because you're in jail, you're out of sight, you're out of mind. Yeah. You're not like in the public spotlight like police or fire.
Thank you for sharing all that with us. So now I want our listeners to get to know you a little bit better now. You share a lot on Facebook, and I know you love to read, but what else do you like to do when you're not working?
Yeah, I like to read. I try to read one book, sometimes 2 books a week. I don't post all of the books that I read on Facebook. I read a lot for 2 reasons. That's a big chunk of what I do on my free time, though. Yeah. I heard something once, and I said it to somebody recently, but the person who doesn't read has no real advantage over the person who cannot read. There's just so much to know. And I only pretty much exclusively read nonfiction, but I'll read about astrophysics. I'll read about neuroscience. I'll read about the economy, history, rarely corrections. I don't often read about corrections. And last 10 years, I've only read 1 book on corrections, but I'll read a lot about politics and international relations, a lot about IR stuff. But so that I like to do that. I like to do my own, working on painting my own barn. I have a barn at my house. I'm painting my house over. I'm doing a little bit at a time. I am recovering right now from 2 different injuries, both to my left shoulder, one in May of 2023 and then one in May of 2024. 2 different injuries, but I haven't hurt the same shoulder. But otherwise, jiu-jitsu, martial arts, I'm a full instructor in Jeet Kune Do and Filipino Kali. I would be a 3rd or 4th degree black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu right now if I had stayed consistent with that when I started back in the early 90s, because I was the first generation of Americans to start training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu when the Gracies came over in the late 80s, early 90s. So when I was in my teenage years, I used to fly out to West Los Angeles to train at Hicks and Gracie's Academy in Pico Boulevard. So I did that a bunch of times back in the mid to late 90s, and I used to fly out to California to do my training. I did some training here as well. But then just, spending time with my dog. I leave a quiet life, really. I've never had a drink of alcohol in my life.
Really?
Never had a cigarette. So I don't go to bars. If I'm sitting at a bar, I'm not having a drink. I might be having water and a sandwich or something. But yeah, I like to travel. I'm actually going to be going to South America next.
Awesome.
I usually go to the Middle East to vacation, but next up is Panama, see the Panama Canal, the Machu Picchu in Peru, and Buenos Aires in Argentina. I'm going there for about 9 or 10 days very soon.
That's awesome. Yeah. So you mentioned your dog, Sashi. What does Sashi mean to you?
What does she mean to me?
Yeah.
In terms of the name Sashi, or her as a little animal?
Her as a little animal.
She is just the most precious thing. There's one word to describe her, and that's happy.
Love it.
She's just always happy. She loves people.
Love it.
If I'm walking down the road and she wants to say hi. She has to say hi to everyone.
That's awesome.
Her name,
Yeah.
Musashi, is short for Miyamoto Musashi. Now, everybody's heard of The Art of War by Sun Tzu.
Yep.
That's Chinese. So Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War. A guy named Miyamoto Musashi wrote the Book of Five Rings, which is Japanese. So the Chinese have The Art of War, Japanese have the Book of Five Rings. And Musashi was his last name. Musashi, he was a samurai. So I just went from Musashi to Sashi.
I like it.
So Sashi is named after a samurai.
I love that. How old is she?
She's 5.5.
Excellent. All right. Thank you for sharing that with us. So you served as mayor of Attleboro from 2018 to 2022, correct?
Yep, at the very end of 2022. Yeah, so five years to the day. Yep.
What was your favorite part about being mayor?
Being mayor was the most rewarding job I've ever had, but it was also the worst 5 years of my life. It really was. There were some really great things that you could get done. There were people who really appreciate when you build a sidewalk. That was one of my favorite things was building sidewalks in Attleboro, because even though I passed a bunch of green ordinances to make the city a cleaner, greener place. Now, first of all, most of those aren't even being enforced, and they can also be changed. But I did that because I knocked on a lot of doors and a lot of people wanted to see the green preservation. But a sidewalk is different. Once you put a sidewalk down in a neighborhood, that's not going to be undone by an ordinance. Nobody's going to come along and undo a sidewalk, because if people use the sidewalks, like I put about 5 miles of sidewalks throughout the city during my 5 years, and most of it came at the tail end of it. The whole sidewalk all the way down Park Street, that was built under Kathleen DeSimone, but it was something I planned and funded before I left the office, and mostly funded. She finished the funding, and kudos to her for that. But that was something I really enjoyed, was building sidewalks. It's just, people can get out and just walk and be healthy, and kids can stand on the side of the road and wait for a bus safely. Just people can get out and enjoy their neighborhoods. And it's just like the sidewalk on Reed Street that I built is about 2 miles long. I see people using that all the time. I used to never see people walk on Reed Street. Now people can get out and just enjoy their neighborhood and just be healthy. And it was something where you can give back to that community, like you can give that in, just make it a better place, and people are just happier at home, especially when you can get out and just go for a walk. I can't understate that enough.
Yeah, in simple terms too, sidewalks connect the community. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, the high.
Go ahead.
The high school project was a big project.
Yeah.
That was done on time and on budget. We had a great team working on that, and give them credit for making that happen. If it hadn't gone on time and on budget, it would have been on my head. So I attended all the meetings and watched those over. And then I think one of the most distracting thing about being mayor, aside from the nonsense on social media, like the ridiculous comments on social media. In fact, it's interesting. A couple of the people who were some of the biggest headaches and biggest trolls are now getting involved in the process. Like they're running for office or are elected. And it's just, it's funny seeing it's just now that they're running, they were the biggest trolls. Now they're being trolled and they're just like crying about it. It's like, oh my gosh. But COVID was another really challenging aspect of the job as well, because there was no playbook. And that happened right at my beginning of my second term.
Yeah. So how challenging was it to lead the city during COVID?
Early on, it was easier than later on.
Okay.
Because early on, it wasn't so politicized. Early on, people would go ahead and mask up. They would do the social distancing. But over the course of time, people started to add politics to it and said, you know what, the masks don't work, and vaccines, I'm an anti-vax or whatever. And as it became more political, it became a challenge. Inside City Hall, there was not a single case of anybody catching COVID in City Hall when COVID was going on. Now, people caught COVID, but they wouldn't trace it back to City Hall.
Gotcha.
And that's not something I was pulling the strings on. It was just, I ran a really tight ship with that. Some of the other departments were a little less cooperative outside of City Hall. I remember going to one particular department, and as I was walking around, like nobody was masked up. I was like, are you kidding me? It was really frustrating because I don't know what the issue was, but I was really hopping on the department heads about this. One particular department was worse than others. And it was actually very frustrating that they wouldn't. Masks catch the respiratory droplets. The science is clear. They help reduce the spread of airborne viruses. And the rest, you can watch videos of the vapor coming out. Even when you're outside when it's freezing cold and you're breathing, you can see your vapor coming out. Put a mask on, you see a lot less. So masks help. But that was a big challenge, though, is some of the employees who didn't want to mask up.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. So do you think the future is bright for the city of Attleboro? What's the future of our city look like?
I think it's going to do well. Yeah, I do. I think we have, the reason I think we have a bright future in Attleboro is, in my opinion, we have a good voting base. And they've selected, I'm biased in saying this, but we've selected good mayors. I ran against Kevin Dumas. But in fairness to Kevin, he was an excellent mayor. He really was. He was youngest ever elected. He was the second longest serving mayor. And I ran against him because I thought it was time. I and a lot of other people thought it was time for change. But he was an excellent mayor. He knows municipal government far better than I do. He's done it for 21 years. I did it for 5. So he's really sharp. He came after Judy Robbins. Judy Robbins was also an excellent mayor, very smart. She knew the city really well. And we've had a long line of good mayors. So I think that the voting public they pay attention to the mayoral races. And for the most part, I would like to think the mayoral races are not partisan. And so people really are going for who's got the best vision for the city. And when the city says it's time to change, like they voted Judy Robbins out, they voted Mayor Dumas out. I didn't get voted out because I left on a high note. I knew that my days, if I had overstayed my welcome, I eventually would have gotten voted out.
So I want to talk international now. You touched
Sure.
on it, but you lived and worked in Saudi Arabia. When was that, and what were you doing for work at the time?
Yeah, so when I was a psychology student, I focused a lot on criminal behavior and child development as well. So when I was working at the Attleboro YMCA, I was working with kids for 7 years, and I focused on like conduct disorder and kids that were ADHD, really troubled kids, bad behavior, and focusing on criminal behavior. And later I did a master's in criminology, but focusing on that. Then when September 11th happened, it was like 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. I was like, this is a new type of criminal behavior I never really thought about before, terrorism. So I wanted to learn about the people, religion, language, politics, just the culture and everything. So I started looking at how can I go to Saudi Arabia. I read a bunch of books about the place and read a bunch of books about terrorism and read a bunch of books about Islam. And I was learning all about like everything we're hearing about in the news. So the easiest way to travel for free is to teach English.
Yes.
And so I went to the University of Cambridge in England, got a teaching certificate at the University of Cambridge, and that gave me the qualification I needed to get into Saudi Arabia. So I got a job in Saudi Arabia, and I was teaching English there for 6 months.
Wow.
I landed in Riyadh, and specifically Al Malaz. Now, you probably never heard of Al Malaz, but Al Malaz is most famous for being the birthplace of Osama bin Laden. So I lived in the neighborhood bin Laden was born in, and there was still some hometown pride there. They say, oh yeah, bin Laden, good man. Yes, he's a good man. We stood up to the Americans and everything, and that was what those were my students, my adult students were saying stuff like that. But I was there for 6 months, and it was a great learning experience. I was back in Saudi Arabia just about almost a year ago, and I was there very briefly as I was out in Egypt, Jordan, and Turkey, and I also was in Saudi Arabia for a minute. It reminded me how much I don't want to go back, though. It was just, I learned a lot, but it was not a fun place. There was nothing fun to do there. Like movie theaters are banned. You're not allowed to speak to women. I didn't speak to a woman the entire 6 months I was there. I got shot at when I was there.
Really?
I was followed. Yeah. I was followed more than one occasion where at one time in Riyadh just stood out the most to me, but it was an active pursuit and I actually dodged whatever would have happened. I don't know. I walked faster than they were able to follow me driving. And I didn't live in a compound. compounds back then in 2003, those things were bomb magnets. Every time we had a compound blow up, Western compound, I'd have to write home to my parents or email them and say, hey guys, I wasn't in that compound. I'm living in the community. Or every time like American or Westerner was kidnapped and beheaded or something, and hey guys, it wasn't me. So it was, but I was there in Riyadh for a little while. Then I went to Jubail on the Persian Gulf and swam in the Persian Gulf, got extremely sick.
Oh,
it was
boy.
one of those polluted waters, but that was 100 miles south of Kuwait. And yeah, it was my first sandstorm as well.
Wow.
Yeah, interesting time.
Were you like walking around traveling in Saudi Arabia solo, or was there a group of Americans that you were with, or you were just out there solo?
I was there pretty much solo, but the company I worked for was a private company, and it was Al Raji, a human resource division, and they had a subsidiary that farmed out. So I would teach at King Abdullaziz University, or I would teach at SABIC, Saudi Basic Industries Corporation, and I would teach adults English. And these adults, all men, all males, they would invite me over their homes after work for dinner and stuff. But I didn't live in a compound. The apartments that I would live in sometimes had other British expats as other English teachers as well.
Yep.
But I was the only person from the United States there. Everybody else was a British English teacher.
Do you remember some of the meals that you were invited to?
Oh yeah, very much. I have pictures of them, and a lot of times what it would be is a very large, and you can see on the video that we have, it would be something probably, as you can see, my arms
Yep.
are about this big, maybe 2.5 feet across, big, huge platter of a lot of rice.
Okay.
And on top of that, you'd have a sheep or a lamb. And then you'd have a lot of vegetables around it as well. And you just eating with your right hand because you wipe your butt with your left hand. And they don't have toilet paper there, although I carried a roll of toilet paper everywhere I
Smart
went.
man.
So yeah, but you'd rip food off with off the, for lack of a better term, the carcass.
Sure.
You rip that off and you would just eat. Sometimes you would even rip something off and you would share it with the person next to you. So there was no sense of, you touched that food and now you're handing it to me to put in my mouth. I didn't think in those terms. It was very communal.
Interesting. So you also traveled to North Korea, China, Egypt, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. Were those work trips or leisure?
For the most part, I would call those like leisure trips.
Sure.
Yeah. And
Okay.
so the things I've actually behind me, you can see on the video.
I see it. Yep.
Flags. Yeah. So those are the countries that I've been to. So I've been, of course, Mexico and Canada and Guatemala, Honduras, a lot of European countries, lived in London, but North Korea was just tourism. Egypt was tourism. Jordan was tourism. I've been to Turkey. Israel and Palestine was part of a delegation. It was a political delegation, so that was work related. It was 5 days in Israel, 5 days in Palestine. But then, I like to try and travel around. Sometimes I don't travel for several years at a time. Other times I'll go to several countries in 1 year.
Of those countries, which one do you think was your favorite and why?
I don't have a favorite.
Okay.
Each one of them had something different to offer. For example, living in London was really cool because I learned how much the United States was the center of, it became like a unipolar world. I never really had a sense of that until I lived in London, and there was so much focus and emphasis on what's going on in the United States. In Saudi Arabia, that challenged a lot of my assumptions of what I thought about the world. Like Saudis, you're in this country where everybody really believed there are 52 states in the United States. And sometimes I would joke and I'd say, what do you mean? It's Israel and Kuwait, number 51 and 52. And say they joke, they're like, they're funny. But no, they actually really believed 52 U.S. states. And so I was like, wait, do you think maybe Alaska and Hawaii are 51 and 52? And they said, no. And so Los Angeles is a state. And I was like, no, that's actually a city inside California. But they think so that became a whole lesson in itself. Yeah. But that really, what I'm getting at, though, is that they really challenged me. They were so convinced there were 52 states. And I'm never 100% convinced of anything. I always question my own knowledge about things. I actually said, did something change since I was in 7th grade geography? Did we adopt 2 new states that I didn't know about? So I went back and I was like, oh, yeah, we still have 50 states. But they were so convinced that everybody believed it. I started to doubt whether or not, and I just a little fact check on that. Some people might say, oh my God, you're ridiculous. How stupid. But is 52 states really stupid? Donald Trump is talking about Canada and Greenland right now. I don't think that's ever going to happen, but it's Hawaii and Alaska. Hawaii only became a state in the 1959 or 1958 or something. So anyway, I digress a little bit.
It's okay. So you've been to all these countries. Besides being shot at, Sheriff Heroux, did you feel safe in all of the other places, or were there any other close calls or things like that?
Okay, so North Korea, I was with an organized tour, and there was a government representative with us the entire time. And as long as you don't mess around, like you know where you are, don't talk about democracy, don't talk about religion, don't criticize the regime, don't steal stuff. You know where you are. Go there, do what they like. Look at what they tell you to look at. Don't look at what they don't want you to look at, and then you'll be okay. With Israel and Palestine, I was very comfortable in the Palestinian West Bank and the West Bank territories. I was very comfortable there. I never felt that I was threatened or anything. I was actually more comfortable in the West Bank than I was in Saudi Arabia for sure. Turkey, Istanbul, I was there for 4 days. The first time I went there, that was nothing. It was like walking around London. It never felt like unsafe or anything. Yeah, if you're like a seasoned traveler, like you know what to do, what not to do, you should be okay, but there's no guarantees. For a long time, I've wanted to go to Iran, but I haven't yet got a visa yet. Eventually, I'll get in there.
There you go. Real quick, and then we'll move on to the next question. How long were you in North Korea?
9 days. And I was with 24 classmates from grad school. We got in through a Chinese tour company, and I actually flew on the world's least safe, the most unsafe airline, Air Korea. It has it's got a reputation for being the world's least safe airline. And North Korea was interesting though, because they have cars with steering wheels on the left side of in the car. Yeah. They also have cars with steering wheels on the right side. Okay. Because they will take whatever they can get from wherever they can get it, because they have so many sanctions on them, economic sanctions. So they can't just import Toyotas, or they can't just import Fords. So if they can get something secondhand from somebody else, they'll just take it. And the roads were terrible. Oh God, the roads were the only place in the United States that I can remember that had roads as bad. Actually, they weren't even that bad, but was when I was in New Orleans, Louisiana. The roads there were really bad, but North Korea was even worse.
Oh boy. How was it on that flight? How long was that flight on that airline? It
was very short. It was just from Beijing to Pyongyang, and it was maybe an hour flight. I'm going back to August of 2013, but it was probably about an hour flight. It wasn't long, maybe 2 hours at most.
So you weren't too nervous about it? You do okay flying?
Back then, it was the world's least safe airline.
I would have walked. I would have walked, Sheriff. I don't know.
Yeah.
All right.
Korea, went to the DMZ. So you're speaking about walking. You really can't just walk into North Korea, but I've been into the DMZ, which is actually anything but demilitarized. There's landmines everywhere.
Oh, jeepers, man. My goodness. All right. So you touched on this a little while ago, but had you run into any trouble in those countries, I think you would have been okay, because you have been training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu since 1993. I take it that has always been a passion of yours?
Yeah, Brazilian. I actually started in other things before Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, like Jeet Kune Do and Filipino martial arts. Started that like probably a couple of years before that, 2 or 3 years. And actually, I learned about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu through JKD, but I also did Kempo, did Taekwondo through a friend of mine, Western boxing, Western wrestling. So I've studied the footwork of capoeira as well. So I've done a lot in the footwork of fencing. So I've spent a lot of time in different things. But having said that, it's not like James Bond 07 or Mission Impossible where you can just fight your way out of it, or Jason Bourne, you can just beat your way out of a situation. So if I had been detained, you really can't just fight your way out like in the movies. You really have to, on your own, figure it out, because you really can't rely on the government to bail you out, because some people are held as a pawn for years and years, and sometimes the government our State Department doesn't come through for a long time. Sometimes it's not the State Department's fault. The other country just doesn't want to cooperate. Sometimes they're going to fabricate charges against you. Anything can happen.
Absolutely. Sheriff, I really want to thank you for being a guest on the podcast. Is there anything else that you'd like the people of Attleboro to know, or is there a message, one takeaway to everyone listening? What would it be?
I've been elected for over 12 years now, and the people of Attleboro are my base, and I've knocked on like thousands and thousands of doors in Attleboro, sometimes multiple times. And so I'd like to thank Attleboro for giving me the chance to serve them and to trust me to do a good job. But I've enjoyed it, and I've really appreciated the trust that the city's put in. And hopefully I've done some good things. I know everybody's not going to always agree with me on everything, But that's why I post everything I do on Facebook almost every day. Even if you don't agree with me, at least you're going to know what I'm doing and you can ask questions about it. And I think that's government at its finest, is being transparent and accountable.
Said Sheriff Heroux, thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it, sir.
Cool. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. I certainly learned a lot during my discussion with the sheriff, and I hope you did too. And I thank him for taking the time out of his busy schedule to make some room for the Life in Attleboro podcast. Hey, I want to tell you about our new sponsor, Hoban Accounting Services. If you're a small business owner, you know how much of a hassle it can be to keep track of every penny earned and every penny spent. But thankfully, Hoban Accounting Services is on a mission to heal your headaches and fizzle your frustration when it comes to crunching those pesky numbers. Hoban Accounting Services has helped local businesses for more than 7 years. That's when Nicole Hoban, a proud mother of twin girls, launched her business. She's a QuickBooks Pro Advisor with tons of awards to her name. If you mention the Life in Attleboro podcast, you'll get 10% off for your first 6 months. If you'd like to support a small business owner in our city, just tap the link in the show notes of this episode and Nicole will be in touch. Hoban Accounting Services. A great bookkeeper should be an asset, not an expense. Have you signed up for the Life in Attleboro email list? We send one email each Friday. It includes exclusive offers from our sponsors, early access to every new podcast episode, and you'll stay in the know about cool events in our great city. Just go to lifeinattleboro.com and you'll see the sign-up display right there on the homepage. You'll also see the sign-up button at the top of our Life in Attleboro Facebook page. And if you know someone who would make a great guest on our podcast, shoot us an email at lifeinattleboro@gmail.com. Life in Attleboro is a great thing. Support our community, promote positivity, and make a stranger smile. Have a great day, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Life in Attleboro podcast.